Hi, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, and this is my weekly edition of the War on Misinformation. Every week I have a great deal of difficulty deciding what to focus on here because there is just so much material out there. I could fill up hours of broadcast every day with the kind of misinformation that's commonly published in major media around Australia about housing markets. But I found a few things to focus on today, and I want to start with a couple of articles that have appeared in some of the more magazine-y type real estate products recently, and where they completely misunderstood what the information that was sent to them actually meant and misrepresented in a quite a serious way. This comes out of the fact that most of what's written about the Australian housing market and the various markets around Australia in media is generated by press releases. It didn't used to be like that in the days when I was a real estate editor for newspapers. You generated your own stories by talking to people and being informed. But today, most of what's written about real estate is basically a rewritten press release, which is dangerous because a press release by its nature is a piece of propaganda in which the person sending in the press release has a vested interest. So anyway, some of these magazines, like Smart Property Investment is one, and also we've got the Real Estate Business Bulletin. They received a press release from CoreLogic. So often the most publicity hungry organisation in the country, and they're pumping out press releases all the time. And this one ended up being reported as saying that 75% of properties that sold in the last 3 months were sold for less than their original purchase price. Now that mistake appeared at the top of a number of these magazine articles. Over the 3 months to October, more than 3/4 of properties that sold transacted for less than their original purchase price. What that's saying is that the people who sold property actually sold for less than they paid when they bought it. That's not what the information said, nothing like it. What the information actually said was that 75% of properties sold in the last quarter sold for less than the original asking price. So the people selling the property listed the property, here's the asking price, and they eventually sold for less than that asking price. Very, very different from what was reported by these magazines. One was a situation that suggested a calamity, that people were selling for less than they paid, which isn't the truth. The real situation, as it should have been reported, is that 3/4 of properties were selling for less than their asking price. And that's a perfectly normal thing. That happens even in strong markets. It happens in boom markets. Most properties actually sell for less than their asking price, even when markets are booming like Sydney has been recently. And that's because people always, mostly anyway, put a fairly optimistic asking price when they list their properties to allow some negotiation room. What the price they actually expect to get or want to get is less than the asking price, and that's normal. So some level of discounting, even in strong markets, is the norm. So there was nothing particularly alarming or headline worthy about this. It's just that they completely misunderstood or misrepresented the information that was presented to them and ended up with a quite alarming piece of misinformation. Okay, turning to other matters, the biggest problem continues to be on a daily basis that journalists, either through ignorance or because they don't give a damn, are reporting what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne as a national property decline. Now, it simply isn't true. There are more markets across Australia with rising prices than there are with falling prices. The problem is most of our major media comes out of Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne. They're completely obsessed with their own situation, as they have been for the last 5 years. When Sydney and Melbourne were booming, media kept writing the Australian property boom. Well, we didn't have an Australian property boom. We didn't have a boom in Brisbane or Adelaide. Canberra's been chugging along okay, but it certainly hasn't boomed. Perth and Darwin going backwards. Hobart sort of had a bit of a mini boom more recently, but we certainly have never had a national property boom any time in the last 5 years, but that's what was written. And equally, now that Sydney and Melbourne are moving into their downturn phase, that's been extrapolated across the country and turned into a national slump, which also isn't happening. We never had a national boom. We don't have a national slump. It's just this self-absorption that Sydney people primarily seem to have. But here we have the Australian journalist called Michael Rodden and Mackenzie Scott writing, the first words are sliding house prices across the nation. Simply isn't true. Then they go on to actually reveal in the article that they're actually talking about Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne, where prices overall are generally definitely down, but in a fairly moderate and well orderly fashion as far as we're seeing from the figures today. They always quote the most negative figures, by the way. There's 5 or 6 major sources of price data. Most of them have more moderate decline figures than CoreLogic, but CoreLogic is the one that gets published the most because they have the most negative figures, and media just loves negative. So there we have the Australian, a great source of misinformation on real estate, talking about sliding house prices across the nation. Here we have Fairfax Media talking about Australia's current housing market slump. Again, when you look at the article, it talks exclusively about Sydney and reveals, well, not exclusively, later in the article reveals that Hobart and Canberra prices are continuing to grow, and that Brisbane and Adelaide don't have a downturn either. But at the top of the story, they talk about the Australian market slumping. Here's David Scutt, who frequently writes negative rubbish in newspapers like The Age in Melbourne, begins a story by talking about Australia's housing downturn. And so it goes on a daily basis. Here's one I'll talk about in some detail in a moment, written by Emily Cadman in The Age newspaper, talking about the nation's housing boom turning to dust. Yeah, okay. So they constantly write about a national downturn, but what do the figures show us? Well, as I said, the figures most published are CoreLogic because they pump out more press releases than anybody else. They're also the most negative of the figures. Most of the other major reputable sources of price data have more moderate figures for Sydney and Melbourne than they do. But anyway, the recently published CoreLogic figures show that 5 of the 8 capital cities have rising prices still, whether you look at it monthly or whether you look at it in annual terms. Brisbane, Adelaide, Hobart, Darwin and Canberra all have rising prices. So 5 of the 8 have rising prices, and collectively the combined regional figure is also a positive. So the vast majority of locations around Australia, based on these figures and other figures, have actually rising prices. And some of them, particularly in regional Australia, have very strongly rising prices. Regional Victoria, some parts of regional New South Wales, and now some parts of regional Queensland, headed by the Sunshine Coast. Now, CoreLogic still has Perth prices in a negative, but other sources, including SQM Research and the Real Estate Institute, have Perth house prices rising again. So to a certain degree, it depends on whose figures you believe, but according to the most quoted source and also the most negative, 5 of the 8 capital cities and collectively regional Australia have rising prices, yet we have daily headlines talking about the Australian housing downturn. Sydney-based people obsessed with themselves, basically, that's the problem. Now, turning into that article I mentioned in The Age, written by someone called Emily Cadman recently, a headline talking about the things that killed Australian property boom. Well, we never had an Australian property boom, as I said. She starts out by talking about how the nation's property boom has turned to dust. Untrue. The national property downturn, she says, is now in its 2nd year. Also untrue. We don't have a national downturn. She's talking about Sydney. She goes on to talk about Sydney. She says prices in Sydney are now falling at an annualised rate of about 8%. But my question is, according to whom? She doesn't quote a source. There are multiple sources on price data, and most of them have Sydney's price decline considerably less than 8% at the moment. Certainly SQM Research does. The Australian Bureau of Statistics does, as do other sources. So you cannot state one source as fact because other sources disagree. It's just an opinion. But this article doesn't even say the source of the figures, just states the figures as fact. It talks about the plunge in Australian prices. Well, prices aren't plunging anywhere. They're certainly, generally speaking, in decline in Sydney, but by no stretch of the imagination is it a plunge. She also talks about first home buyers being priced out of the market. Well, first home buyers right now are more active than they've been any time in the last 8 years, according to the figures. In the last 12 months, loans to first home buyers nationally have risen 35%, and in Sydney, they've risen more than 70%. So first home buyers are far from priced out of the market. They're out there very busy. And another clue that this article was rubbish was their source of their negative comment was the most extremely negative commentators out there. There are plenty of commentators having something to say about what's happening with housing markets. Some of them are pumping out regular negative stuff because they know that'll get them lots of publicity, and that's their objective. It's not to inform people, it's to achieve publicity, and you always find that easier to achieve when you say something sensationally negative about the housing market. UBS is one of those people. Any journalist who's got to resort to them as their prime source of information and comment is pretty desperate. Here we have another one, also in The Age. It seems to be a regular source of screaming negatives about the property. This one's written by someone called Fiona Neild, and shows what often crops up in these articles is that the writer actually doesn't understand the subject. They have very little knowledge about real estate. They regurgitate material in press releases, but they don't understand the material they're regurgitating, so it turns into even more serious misinformation. This article by Fiona Neild says that it was inevitable that Sydney would follow. Melbourne, according to her, is in a downturn in the property market because Sydney did, and Melbourne must inevitably follow Sydney. Well, it just doesn't work like that. Markets don't follow one another. Whether markets rise or fall depends on what's happening in the local economy. That's why Sydney and Melbourne had a boom, because their economies were strong in simple terms, whereas Perth and Darwin have been going backwards because their economies locally have been weak. A lot of fallacious statements in this article, particularly the one that attributes the downturn in Sydney and Melbourne to the Banking Royal Commission. Banking Royal Commission is a very recent thing, and the so-called credit squeeze that's arisen out of that. Both Sydney and Melbourne were in their wind-down phases long before the Banking Royal Commission or any of the regulatory dampening down measures that APRA implemented. Sydney, in terms of demand, peaked in 2015-16 and was been steadily winding down in terms of sales activity and demand in the market since then, but it takes time for it to show up in prices. And unfortunately, media tends to use median price movements as their major barometer. It's a very blunt instrument to be measuring markets. Sydney and Melbourne's wind down was well underway before APRA took its measures, and certainly even a longer distance before the Banking Royal Commission. So the impact of that may have exacerbated the situation, but it certainly didn't cause it, because those markets had passed their peak long before the Royal Commission happened. But unfortunately, most of the people writing about real estate really aren't experts, not remotely close to being experts. They're just recycling press releases, and they're doing it in a very uninformed way, and usually with the journalistic mentality, they're doing it in a very sensationally negative way. And they're just adding to the great seething mass of media misinformation. So I repeat, the best advice that I can give to people interested in buying or selling real estate out there: you want to be successful, to understand what's going on, stop reading newspapers. If your method of research is absorbing media sound bites and headlines, you're going to be misinformed and you're going to make bad decisions. That's it for now. The latest edition of my War on Misinformation. I'll do that again, same time next week. Bye for now.